أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Respected brothers, sisters, viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome once again to our series, Life, the Islamic Answer. We were discussing the theme of knowledge and reason in Islam, and within that theme, we had reached the topic of the community of knowledge. Within this topic, we went through a number of headings, and one of them has to do with who belongs to the community of knowledge. And after a general introduction in which we concluded that everyone who is part of a Islamic community or a community of believers has to be part of a community of knowledge, or the community of knowledge, depending on whether there are multiple communities or one community of knowledge. With that conclusion, we should not really spend too much more time having discussions about separate groups within that community, since our conclusion is that everyone has to find a place, a role, a function for themselves within the community of knowledge. That said, there are a number of groups or subgroups within that community. Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah. There are a number of groups or subgroups within the community of believers or the community of knowledge that deserve a little bit more of a discussion for different reasons. One of the reasons could be for the importance of that group at a rational level, at a logical level. When we look at a community, we know that not everyone needs to be given the same importance, including, for instance, those groups that require a special attention or a special care, in the sense that we may have to go out of our way to ensure that those groups are addressed, their needs are addressed, especially if it requires accommodation, if it requires strategic thinking and foresight from the part of the community. And in those cases, we also notice, beyond what reason tells us, that our religion has also taken the extra step of mentioning those groups specifically and spending more time on them, or explicitly mentioning some of their needs and what needs to be addressed for those subgroups. And as an example of this, perhaps one of the most prominent examples of this is by age. The group of the youth, for instance, within the community of knowledge that require a special attention for a number of reasons. One of them being that they can't do this for themselves, especially if we talk about children at a younger age. The community has to have the foresight. Their parents and the community at large has to have the foresight to ensure that their needs are being met and that they are going to be the best that they can be to play the role that they can best play within that community by starting the process preemptively, strategically, with foresight, so that the opportunities are not missed. And we said by opposition, this does not mean that therefore someone should say, it is too late for me, I did not learn what I had to learn when I was a child, therefore it is too late, I'm too old, and so on and so forth. We saw that Islam made a point to say that this line of reasoning is absolutely unacceptable, that we should all remain in a state of seeking knowledge until our last breath in this world, and that there is a special favor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at the person who has advanced in age and who is trying to seek knowledge in a very special way, in a unique way, because there are additional challenges that they are most likely facing in trying to seek their knowledge, including the social challenges, including perhaps that they feel shy or embarrassed that they have to learn with those who are younger or from those who are younger, and so on and so forth. And that's why we saw in the ahadith specific mentions of the old man who sits in front of the youth to learn their knowledge, for instance. And those were simply examples of the types of subcategories that we have seen until now. And we said another one that deserves a little bit of attention and discussion is the relationship between woman and knowledge, or woman and reason, which was the topic of our last discussion. And as we said, the reasons for talking about this can be multiple, numerous. Some of these reasons have to do with the constant attacks against Islam in general that often portray it as a misogynist religion, that specifically when it comes to this theme of knowledge and reason and education, we find attacks against this religion that it does not allow, or that it discourages the scholarship of women or the education of girls and women, that it has a specific position with regards to this issue specifically, that women should not be taught, that they should not learn, that they should not go to school, that they should not be educated or highly educated, and so on and so forth. And as we said, there are multiple ways of addressing this. And those who have taken it upon themselves to defend this religion have done so in multiple ways. We can go back through we can go back through the verses of the Holy Quran and take a Quranic approach. We can look at specific narrations to establish that indeed Islam is not misogynist and that it does not have any negative position from the issue of woman and knowledge and woman and reason. But there could perhaps be another reason, which was my main driver for addressing this issue. It was not so much the external attacks on our religion. The series is not meant for that. We touch here and there on some issues that may help in that regard, but the series is not really meant for addressing attacks against Islam from outside of Islam. The series is meant to educate the Muslim, the believer, about their own faith based on the original scriptures. However, even within our own communities, depending on which communities those may be, and we said it's very inconsistent across the world, we may find similar opinions. Whether these are scattered geographically, or they belong to different ethnic groups, or they belong to different education levels, whatever it may be, depending on which communities we belong to, we may have been exposed to this line of thinking, to this way of understanding gender roles within Islam, and one of its conclusions, either implied or explicitly stated, is that women should not be seeking too much education and too much knowledge for all sorts of reasons. And I don't want to go into the reasons because it becomes irrelevant based on how we framed the discussion. The bottom line is that there seems to be, according to that view, at least a discouragement that Islam discourages women from pursuing higher levels of knowledge. And so we said that there are multiple ways of addressing this. And again, as we would do with the previous attacks, we could also take a very Quranic stance, go through some verses of the Quran to see what they say. We could also specifically try to focus on different hadith to see what we learn from them. Or we could actually look at the history of Islam and the history of Islamic society or Islamic communities to see what they can tell us about how Muslims have dealt with this issue across history, across time. And here we said that we made some choices of methodology, mainly because we don't have too much time to spend. Otherwise, this by itself could become an entire series if we want to be detailed in our answer. We said first, even before going into the manner in which we're going to respond, that we have gone in this series specifically of ours through almost 90 lectures now, talking in a specialized way about the verses of the Holy Quran and the narrations of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, the Holy Prophet and the Imams. We have looked at dozens of verses, we have looked at hundreds upon hundreds of narrations until now. And we did not find a single instance in which our religion is making a distinction between the seeking of knowledge between men and women. And so, at a neutral level, we can say that whatever has applied to the Muslim in general until now applies to both men and women, brothers, sisters, to both genders in the same way. That's the first conclusion from this. Secondly, we did not find any explicit mention that discourages women from learning. And we found specific instances in which women are being encouraged to learn and encouraged to ask questions and encouraged to educate themselves, especially with regards to religious matters. And I don't want to repeat the same things that we have said. We mentioned some of these narrations last week and across the series. And so, if we wanted to look at, or we wanted to focus on the narrations, there is enough evidence in that to extract and present a Islamic position regarding this issue. That there is nothing, and inshallah we'll continue in the series and we'll finish it, and we will see that Islam does not distinguish when it comes to seeking knowledge. If there are distinctions to be made or priorities to be made, even in the type of knowledge to be acquired, it is not that you are a woman or a man. And inshallah we're going to come back to that later in the series. Sometimes there are strong encouragements, and in certain cases it becomes a theological necessity, a religious necessity for someone to learn certain things, certain types of knowledge, or go more in depth in certain types of knowledge. But this is not because you're a man or a woman. And inshallah we will see that later in the series. So that's the first point, and this should be clear. But specifically, so beyond everything we have said and the logical conclusions that we have reached until now, we said that we are trying to now focus on the historical dimension. So it's a little bit different than what we have done throughout the series, but I thought this would be a nice complement to what we have been doing, which is to focus specifically on the primary sources in our religion. We looked at a little bit at history, and we said that there are very strong reasons that pushed us to specifically focus on history. First, it gives us a very clear indication and allows us to respond to these allegations, whether they are internal or external, by looking specifically at what Muslims and Islam has done with this issue over time, at a practical level, even beyond the theory, beyond the theoretical teachings and abstract teachings. How have Muslims actually conducted themselves with regards to this specific issue of woman and reason, woman and knowledge? That's in general. Secondly, and this we did not do for a reason, we could have looked at the households, the families of the Holy Prophet ﷺ and the Imams. And there we would have found one example after another of uniquely exceptional women who had achieved the highest levels of scholarship and knowledge in Islam. But we intentionally did not. If we wanted to have a fulsome discussion about the topic, for sure, we would have started with this. But because we're trying to present a summary, that part, inshallah, because I am focused on addressing our own internal communities. Inshallah, that part is well understood. We can add to it later, inshallah, and we do from time to time. But that part, inshallah, there should be no ambiguity and no doubt about. That if we look at the households of the Holy Prophet and the Imams themselves, we will find numerous cases of women who had achieved the highest levels. We're not now talking about piety, we're not talking about religiousness. We're specifically focused on knowledge, seeking knowledge, learning knowledge, sharing knowledge, teaching others. We're specifically focused on this function. We would find numerous cases of these women throughout the history of the Holy Prophet ﷺ and all of the Imams. We skip that. And the reason is that this is often something that we hear, that perhaps these households are made up of very unique and special individuals, and we should never compare ourselves to them, with the first argument being that they have access to the unseen and the supernatural, and they are surrounded by the Imams and the Holy Prophet, and so on and so forth. And so, of course, who am I to compare myself or even take them as a role model, because it's even unachievable for me. So preemptively, we skipped over that one, even though we should all agree that in principle these women exist. And if Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam as Imams, and the Holy Prophet ﷺ as a prophet and a messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an exceptional human being in this regard, their households are not. And these women were ordinary people like you and I, and yet they achieved these levels. But let's put that argument aside. So we turned our attention to the next best thing. And the next best thing we said would be the households and the families of the scholars. Why did we do that? For a number of reasons. The first, not in any specific order, is that we are looking for things that are documented. And it's very difficult to find documentation about the lives of people unless they belong to the general world of scholarship and knowledge and reason, especially in those times throughout the centuries. Except if you are in the families of scholars, it was more traditional and customary to document a little bit more, including the biographies of these families. And so we have a lot more chances of finding out a little bit more about those individuals. That's one. Another reason, and this is perhaps the most important one, is that today it's very easy to say someone has a certain level of education, certain level of knowledge, especially if we want to look at it from the academic side. There are colleges, there are universities, there are degrees, there are specific levels of degrees and certification and licenses. What do we do when we want to go back 10 centuries ago, when all of this did not exist? How am I to say, how do I justify, how do I demonstrate that there were people, women, who did actually achieve the highest levels of scholarship, who were seeking knowledge, and there were huge amounts of them? How do I achieve that? How do I demonstrate that? At least by going to Islamic scholarship, even though the other educational systems were not in place yet. Very early on, Islam established a very rigorous education system when it came to Islamic sciences and Islamic disciplines of knowledge. Especially when we focus on the system, what is called ijazat, which sometimes are translated as a license you get an ijazah. So it's a license or a certificate, or the best way to translate it is perhaps an attestation from a very qualified, competent authority in the field who says that you have been tested. Either they say you have studied a full course under their tutelage, their teaching, or that they have tested you on so and so, and you have passed the test, the examination. And then you get an ijazah. So the system of ijazat was the main way that the Muslim community put in place to recognize and identify the different levels of expertise of people in different fields of Islamic knowledge. So by focusing on Islamic knowledge and the families of scholars, we now have a very rigorous way of looking at the actual level of knowledge or expertise acquired by these people, and in this case, women specifically. And if we say that someone has an ijazah, certainly this means that this is not a beginner or even an intermediate student. It means that they have completed their education in a field. And depending on the level of the ijazah could also mean that, in a lot of cases, this is what the ijazah actually says. The ijazah says that they are now an authority in the field and they may teach others. By my authority, I am granting them the authority based on my testing, based on their education under me for X number of years. I am giving them the authority, the permission to teach these courses or to be an authority and a reference for Muslims in this field, which is exactly what is done when you reach ijtihad, for instance. This is what it says. That based on my understanding and my knowledge of this person, my assessment of this person, my examination of their works, or my testing of them directly, or them having studied under me, and this is usually explained in the ijazah, people may refer to them as an authority. So when we say that there are women who achieved such a level of education that they were granted ijazah, one, it tells us that this is the highest level of education you can achieve in Islam that is recognized formally. Just like today you would say someone has a PhD. It doesn't mean that there's nothing is left to learn. Of course you can always learn more. Of course not everyone is at the same level. But everybody agrees that the minimal threshold has been achieved here. The PhD has been achieved. Now within that there are a whole continuum of levels. But the minimal threshold is still a PhD, and that by itself is impressive. The ijazah would be considered something of that sort. The other implied conclusion from saying that these women have ijazat, just like the case today. When we want to go back in history, let's say, we want to look at a certain community today, and we want to say, let's see how many people in that community have PhDs. To use an analogy. What does that tell you about the rest of the community? We know in general that from X number of people who study, let's say 1% achieve the level of a PhD, to take an example. So logically we would say from every 100 of those who enter this education system, and not everyone is entering the education system. There are a lot more people who are not even entering the education system. But from those who enter it, from every 100 who enter, there is one who achieves this level. So if we were to apply the same logic to say these women are reaching this level, this rank of having an ijazah, it should also be understood, therefore, that this number needs to be multiplied. Maybe this is 1 in every 100, or 1 in every, to be more logical and consistent, maybe 1 in every 1,000, which means there are 1,000 other women studying. No different than today, and we'll come back to that inshallah. And that's why we said when we're focusing on this, I just want to make sure that the points are clear and why we chose this way of presenting things. It's to say that when we're saying these women have achieved this level, this is representative of how much scholarship was taking place on the side of women throughout Islam. That this many of them were achieving ijazat. It's not to say that these are the only women who were educated and achieved the level of ijazah. Clearly there are many, many, many others who were doing their best and did not achieve that level. But they were still studying, which is the main point we're trying to establish. We're not trying to establish that this ratio or this amount of people achieved ijazat. We're simply trying to say that Islam wants everyone to engage in this knowledge seeking, and that the relationship between woman and knowledge seeking and reason is no different than the relationship between men and knowledge seeking and reason in Islam. Okay? The last point perhaps that we mentioned, and I'll try to go a little bit faster here, I want to focus on the findings from all of this, is that we have to also keep in mind the idea of, which was very predominant, very dominant in those societies, the idea of chastity or hijab. And I'll come back to it at the end. But the extended notion of the hijab and the chastity of woman has a number of ramifications or conclusions. One of them is that a lot of these cases were never going to be documented. Especially in the, where we focused, in the area we focused, which is the households of the scholars, who tend to be even more conservative and more religious, where these notions of hijab and chastity are even more important, to the point where they refuse that the names of their daughters, for instance, or their wives are documented. And that's why we saw examples. When we went through the list, we saw examples where the names are unknown or uncertain. There's confusion about the name because they did not want their names to be known. This is not something for the public to know. But enough has reached us that we know that there is someone. We may not know her name, but we know someone in that household, the daughter of so-and-so, has achieved that level. And how many more cases are there that were never documented because of this? So this is one more factor to keep in mind, that the examples we have are representative of, but we can never hope to know the full scope of what was going on. We can only deduce that this is how much scholarship was taking place on the side of women, because clearly there was an aversion to documenting everything and making it available to the public or accessible to anyone who would dig for it. So what we tried to do is to look specifically, as we said, at the households of scholars for all the reasons that we mentioned. And we tried to do so from about the year 300 after Hijrah to the contemporary times, which is about 1150 years or so. So over 11 centuries. In other words, what we're trying to show is that this has been a consistent tradition in Islam from the onset. And this is another important point. This is not something that has just emerged as a result of some reform movement, in recent times. And we skipped, for reasons that we gave and for brevity, we skipped those first 200 to 300 years intentionally. But if we were to go through it, we would find no fewer examples. In fact, perhaps even more examples during those times. So during those times, we went through the biographies very quickly in the time that we had of about 15 or so women that we looked at a little bit more closely. And in all of those cases, we focused on women from the households of scholars who achieved the highest level of knowledge and expertise in these fields, in these Islamic fields. And specifically, as I said, I did not provide my own biographies of these women. All I did was to read glimpses, a sentence here and there, from the scholars of Rijal and Hadith, who pay a very close attention to the authenticity and the knowledge levels of the transmitters of the Hadith. And so when they use terminology, when they use words, those words have a lot more meaning than how we use them. When they say, for instance, that someone was alim or hafiz or taqi, or these words have now become keys to understanding a whole lot of other notions related to the reliability of this person. And when we went through the biographies of these women, we saw that there's nothing more that could be said. No one could hope to achieve higher levels of, merit, socially recognized expertise in knowledge and religion than what was being said about these women that we looked at. And this is just, as I said again and again, this is just a sampling. We could find many, many fold the same lines and the same wording about other women. The main findings. First is that women did indeed achieve the highest levels of expertise in Islam. And just the fact that women have achieved the highest levels of expertise should therefore be enough, should be sufficient to show that Islam has nothing against women learning, to take it in the minimalist version, or in general, that there is nothing in Islam that excludes them, and that these women at least understood that they are as invited to seek knowledge and to learn as their male counterparts. At least that should be a logical conclusion from what we have looked at in terms of examples. That's first. But in addition to that, and if we want to take the argument a little bit further based on the cases that we looked at, it's not that these women simply achieved the highest recognized standards of education. It's that even in Islamic law specifically, which is perhaps the highest formal rank and level of education recognized in Islam, on both sides, Sunni and Shi'i, is to achieve the level of ijtihad, is to be independent in your ability to reach your own verdicts and legal conclusions in Islam. And this rank was achieved by many, many women throughout history until contemporary times. More findings. Women were recognized for their levels of education and knowledge because they were authors, and we saw multiple examples of this, where some of them were explicitly stated as having been some of the most proficient authors of their time, as we were told by some biographers, or great memorizers, as some of them were mentioned to be. And they were teachers. The women that we looked at, many of them were explicitly stated as also teaching others. And there's a lot of detail that could be added here to the teaching part. Some women, and that would be the majority of them it seems, some women were teaching other women. Some of them were teaching very specialized and very small areas of Islamic disciplines and Islamic knowledge and fields. But some of them were clearly teaching the entire curriculum. And some of them had their houses become centers of knowledge, as we were told. Or today we would say a hawza, a seminary. And some of them became the heads of seminaries. And some of them explicitly, as we saw, were mentioned as having been the heads of seminaries in multiple cities. As we saw in the case of some of them being the heads of the women seminary in Qazwin and Karbala, for instance. And these are not marginal cities. To have a hawza, to have a seminary in a hub, an Islamic center of tashayyu', where you are basically competing with some of the biggest names and heaviest weights in Islamic scholarship, they're all there. And you happen to also have your own hawza there. This is not a small feat. And yet it is recognized and it is respected. And other scholars refer to it and send their students there to learn and to get their ijazat there. So this is to look at, they were not all of the same levels. But Islam was never against anyone stopping at any level because they are simply a woman. That was never an argument. Especially not within the hubs of knowledge and hubs of scholarship, where you would, maybe this is how we should think logically, we should find the greatest resistance to it, because these are the most conservative hubs and the most conservative cities and communities. And we find the opposite. More. we saw how many of these women, they studied and they got certified and they got their ijazat from other women. Maybe that should be understood, logical. Many others got their ijazat from men. Some of these men were family members, but not all. And we saw examples of them. And we see on the other side, many of these women taught other women, true, but many of them also taught men. And some of the men were family members, but many of the men were not. They were scholarship seekers. They were seekers of knowledge. Normal students who came to them to learn or to get an ijazah. In fact, some of them are very known, very great scholars throughout our history. And they have their ijazat, as we mentioned, multiple ones mentioned by himself, and all of them do that. All of our great scholars have written how they got their ijazat, because this is part of their biography, their scholarly biography, so that people understand their chain of transmission. And the ones we looked at more closely, but there are many others. We looked at least 3 of the ijazat of Sayid al-Mar'ashi al-Najafi, a very, very great scholar, highly respected, expert in multiple fields, who passed away about a generation ago or so. At least 3 of his ijazat are through women. He went and studied and got examined by them, assessed by them, and he passed and he got an ijazah. We also have, and we made sure that we mentioned a couple of those examples, we also had some of the great scholars seek I don't want to say necessarily the advice, but at least wanted to engage in discussion with some of these women. As was the case, for instance, of Sayyid Tabatabai, the author of Al-Mizan, which most Shia unanimously consider to be the greatest tafsir that we have. Many of our Shia, they say this is the greatest mufassir of the greatest tafsir, given its depth, given its nuances, and so on and so forth. And we saw that in his biography, he would write letters seeking the discussion with a woman who was a well-known mujtahid in his time. And we said about her that she also wrote her own tafsir of the Quran. He knows who he's writing to. He's asking for a scholarly discussion about certain topics related to tafsir and perhaps other topics. But clearly this is another indication that in the scholarly world, there was no aversion from many of our greatest scholars that this is a man and this is a woman. The focus was on knowledge. We're all knowledge seekers. And I recognize you for your expertise and your competence, your ability to do what you do with knowledge. That's all that matters. One other finding that inshallah I made clear one way or another, I hinted to it across and then we mentioned it quickly at the end, the role of the family. And that was also part of the reason for choosing to focus on the families of scholars. There is no doubt that in these cases, it's a lot easier for these women to acquire the knowledge because they are in households of scholarship. When your father is a great scholar, your brother is a great scholar, you marry a man who's also a scholar, of course this is an environment that is very conducive to scholarship, but not necessarily. Because for every one of these women, there were thousands of others who never engaged in scholarship. You don't have to. No one is forcing you. But in those cases, they took advantage of that. And clearly, they reaped the results. And so this is a lesson for us too. That this is it should be part of our life plans. If we understand what we have been saying in this series until now, and the importance of knowledge, depending on where all of us are in our lives and our lifetimes and our life plans, if we understood the importance that our religion has given to knowledge and knowledge seeking and reason and rationality and so on and so forth, then when it comes time for spouse selection, I would say there's a very strong argument being made in these stories that this will go a very long way, and it goes both ways. And we saw the examples in both cases where a man marries a woman and he knows that this is a scholar, or she knows he's a scholar, and they help each other on this path. And we saw some great scholars who were married to women who would help them understand what they were studying. It was complicated, and she had an ijaza in this field, in fiqh. As we mentioned in the case of Al-Muhaqqiq al-Shaykh al-Mazandarani, one of the commentators, perhaps one of the most famous commentators of Al-Kafi, and his association with the family of Al-Majlisi, where she would help him and he would help her. And this is the case with many, many others. And we also saw the cases where that woman would also become the mother and then the grandmother of many other scholars, boys and girls, who will turn out to be scholars. Well, this of course is going to have huge ramifications, not only on you, but in the descendants that you are leaving in this world. To choose the right person as a spouse with this as one of the criteria that you're looking at. There's a whole discussion that I didn't go to, but if we want to focus specifically on ijazat and specifically on the transmission of hadith, there are scholars who have looked at this to show how the way the hadith was being passed down in Islamic society or in Islamic communities went in all directions, including taking a hadith from your husband or from your wife as part of the chain of transmission, as well as your brother, as well as your sister, as well as your father, as well as your mother, and so on and so forth. And this is an important but perhaps too scholarly point for our discussion. Clearly, from all of this, we're concluding that there was never any contradiction between Islam and knowledge seeking, with specifically the point around piety, chastity, and hijab. And this is perhaps a point that could be made. I'm not going into too much detail, but clearly in all of those cases, these women and these men were able to achieve these levels of scholarship, to get their ijazat, to get their education. This is an education that lasted for years. And if we wanted to, we could go through the details of how was this achieved without ever going against the general notion of hijab. And I will come back to it with one quote at the end related to this. We're told, unless you're looking at very specific and very exceptional cases in Islamic history, where there are women who dedicated themselves to knowledge and religion and never got married and never had children, the crushing majority of these women were all women who got married and who had children and who led an otherwise normal life. And this goes also against the idea that it's either or. They're mutually exclusive. You have to make this very important life choice that will take your life either as having a home and a family with children or becoming a scholar. We didn't go into too many details. I explicitly mentioned a few of them because they are explicitly mentioned in their biographies, and they are quite impressive details when they say that many of these women had over 6 children, and 7 and 8 and 10 and 12 children. And they are achieving a level of ijtihad. And they have ijazat. This is not to take away anything from how much responsibility and how much time and how much effort is sacrificed by the woman during the time that she is pregnant and especially in young age for her children. But clearly, if you go back through our Islamic history, you can see that this was not enough of a pretext, enough to hinder the knowledge seeking, not to just knowledge seek, not to just acquire a certain amount or certain level of education, but to reach the highest levels of expertise with ijazat. And she could also have done all of this without anyone knowing. No, she took on the social role and the social duty and had the social recognition through the ijazah. Otherwise, she doesn't need the ijazah. You can learn for yourself and it stops there. But they didn't. So all of that to say, if we go back through all of this, there is no excuse, including motherhood. And again, this is not to take away anything from the importance and the sacrifices around motherhood. The quote that we read last week, and I think it's important and worth reading again. We were running out of time, as we are again today, to focus on the findings of all of this. The quote comes to us from Muhammad Akram Nadwi, who is a very well-respected and recognized scholar in both the Islamic world and the Western world. Fully educated Islamically in the Sunni school, and an expert in hadith, an expert in rijal with multiple works in that field, in Arabic and in English. And the same can be said for his Western education and teaching, where he teaches in the most well-recognized universities in the world in this field, in hadith and Islam in general. So in one of his works, which is called Al-Muhaddithat, the women scholars in Islam, this was in 2007, the quote that we read quickly, I'll read it again. Again, I don't want to comment on it. There's a lot that we can say about some of the passages. He says, I have worked through much material. So he was writing, as we said, in 2007, after he spent more than a decade working on this project that he's going to mention now. So I'll update it at the end, and I did last week. I have worked through much material over a decade to compile biographical accounts of 8,000 muhaddithat. This is a gigantic number. 8,000 women who are transmitters of hadith in Islamic history. He says, I've spent 10 years of my life compiling their biographies. That's not the point. So the point is, this is what we were saying. The point is, not one of them is reported to have considered the domain of family life inferior, or neglected duties therein, or considered being a woman undesirable or inferior to being a man, or considered that, given aptitude and opportunity, she had no duties to the wider society outside the domain of family life. He says, I went through the biographies of 8,000 of these women who are playing this role. I did not find a single instance where any of them expressed any idea in this regard, which today is the perhaps first claim against Islam, first attack against Islam. He says, I couldn't find in 8,000 biographies of women over 10 years, I couldn't find a single instance where any of these claims were made by any of these women in any of their biographies. He also says, this is the point that we wanted to make about the hijab. He also says, a few pages later, this is the 18th page of his, the preface to his book, he says, women scholars acquired and exercised the same authority as men scholars. Both did so within the well-known Islamic conventions of hijab and of avoiding, to the extent practicable, such mixing of men and women as can lead to forbidden relationships. So this is another attack or another claim that is perhaps made that this is impossible to do without a lot more mixing between men and women and so on and so forth. So he's also going out of his way to mention this, and he has a few pages in his preface specifically dedicated to the notion of hijab, the extended notion of hijab. So hijab does not mean, a head covering, for instance. He's talking about the whole etiquette around what it means to have decent, respectable relationships between men and women. And that's why the way he words it is important. He's not talking about a piece of clothing, right? He says women scholars acquired and exercised the same authority as men scholars. Both did so within the well-known Islamic conventions of hijab. Men and women. He's not talking about the piece of cloth. Right? Men and women both did so within the well-known Islamic conventions of hijab. There are ways to do this without sacrificing these important Islamic notions. That's what he's saying. They were able to achieve these levels of scholarship without having to sacrifice the main teachings and notions in Islam. Another finding, and this would also require a whole discussion, but very quickly, as a hint. In practice, clearly, women also need a reference and also need role models and also need to associate in idea, in spirit, and in body, physically, to women like them. And this is not to say it should be exclusive. We're not saying men have to learn from men or women have to learn from women. As we saw, both ways, everything was happening. We have instances of all. Even in the case of a normal community, we had instances. The daughter of Sayid al-Awwal, as you will remember, clearly in her biography, it was said that men and women in the thousands would refer to her for their religious verdicts. In other words, today we would say she was their marja'. Was she officially their marja'? Perhaps not. But they were still referring to her and to her legal opinions to understand religion and to practice religion. So the idea here is that in general we know that this was happening. She was called Sitt al-Shuyukh, you'll remember. This was happening. But generally speaking, we know that it is more effective for women to have a role model and a teacher and someone that they can refer to who is also a woman. For many, many reasons. There are psychological reasons, social reasons, educational reasons. And today I would say there's an even greater need for it. Women need to have women voices, especially when it comes to women issues. To speak for their own selves, to represent themselves, and not to have a male voice having to represent them. There's a need for that. And in fact, when we see in practice, we saw that scholars were referring people back to the woman. And we saw many examples in their biographies where we would see the scholar, the marja' of his time, refer people, especially women, to so-and-so woman. They would say, for such matters, go to her. She's the authority and you need to go consult her to understand from her directly. Don't come to me for these things. This is important. And as we said, and inshallah that discussion was clear, you can go back to it, early when we started to talk about the notion of community in Islam, and we tried to establish it, the community of knowledge, when we started to talk about the topic of community, we spent a little bit of time on فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ طَائِفَةٌ. You remember the verse from Surah At-Tawbah, right? It said, it's not necessary for the believers that they should all go forth at once, without exception. And then the Quran asks, why shouldn't a party from each group go forth in order to acquire deep understanding in religion, to warn their people when they return to them, so that perhaps they will be aware? You'll remember that discussion. And one of the conclusions that we reached when we talked about this, we had here, I remember, and I wrote it down, I had over 10 conclusions from that verse. The 8th one, we had a whole discussion about the importance, if we understand what this verse is saying, of having reference points in our religion from within our community. Not relying on, the Quran is saying, the Quran is saying from every group, there should be a few who go and seek Islamic knowledge and come back to their people. Because not everybody can, the beginning of the verse is saying, not everybody can go. It's not becoming. It shouldn't be that all Muslims, all believers go and become experts in religion. That's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling them, teaching them. But for every group, there should be a few of them who go and become experts and come back to their people so that they may warn them. This is what the verse is saying. Why? This is what we're talking about. You need people from within your community like you. The more like you, the better. They understand what you're dealing with. They understand your language, your way of thinking, your worldview, your reality, your challenges. And they have enough of an expert understanding of religion that they can help you with this. And this would apply to women. No different. For women, they can rely on someone like them. As we said, not exclusively. We're not saying it has to be exclusive. But the Quran is saying there are benefits to this. To the extent possible, if we are able to replicate this model, we should. A few points for consideration. And inshallah, we're going to come back to this later. I just want to park them for now so that no one says we left chunks or parts of the discussion without answer. Should women prioritize specific types of knowledge over others? The short answer is yes. The details will come when we talk about types of knowledge. But I will add, yes, women should prioritize certain types of knowledge, but not because they're women. Because the same answer applies to men. Should men prioritize certain types of knowledge? Yes. Should engineers prioritize certain types of knowledge? Yes. Should the youth prioritize certain types of knowledge? Yes. Businessmen? Yes. Every category of people should prioritize certain types of knowledge. The reasons should also be clear just from the way I'm saying it, and inshallah it will be a lot clearer when we talk about the types of knowledge and how do we prioritize them. In short, should they prioritize? Yes, they should. The second, should women prioritize between knowledge and other duties? How much knowledge should I learn? Should I prioritize knowledge over other duties? I may have family duties, I may have social duties, I may have professional duties. Is there a prioritization that has to happen where I have to see what comes first? I'm not saying by automatically putting knowledge first. I'm saying an examination of the priorities. Should that take place? Yes. And inshallah, we'll talk about that when we talk about the types of knowledge. But in short, same thing as before, this is not specific to women. This applies to everyone. Islam will give us general principles. Whoever finds themselves in that context where those principles apply to them, you will know what to prioritize and in what way. And Islam says prioritize. No one can learn everything. And no one can be in a state of learning. And no one should think that everyone is going to achieve the highest level of expertise, as we saw from this verse in Surah At-Tawbah. A small group within the community can and may and should be able to achieve the highest level of expertise. Not everyone. From within that, so we're not expecting everyone to now leave everything behind and go do that. And what if you have other duties? What do we do in those cases? Inshallah, we'll talk about that. But in short, yes, there is a prioritization because Islam is realistic. A last point is that in today's world, for anyone who wants to look into this, and this is a ripe field for study, there are thousands upon thousands of women in the Islamic world who are studying religion. In the traditional sense, through seminaries and hawzat and the old circles of knowledge in Islam, the jalasat, learning Quran, learning fiqh, learning seerah, akhlaq, so on and so forth. This is happening all over the world. And the same thing can be said on the academic side too. And many of the women are combining both, with huge numbers of PhDs in one form or another of Islamic studies being held by women. So inshallah, this alone is also an argument against the main claim for which we dedicated this whole lecture. That's one. Two, inshallah, with time, these discussions become obsolete and we don't need to talk about them. That this is normalized enough that this becomes a non-issue. Today it is still an issue. We're just trying to show the scope, the volume with which or about which we're talking so that it becomes normalized. These are not exceptional cases, right? And when I mentioned earlier, for instance, when Nadwi is mentioning that he has studied 8,000 biographies, he released that work because Al-Muhaddithat was one volume where he talks in general about this field in 2007. Then about 3 years ago, the book was finally released, and I mentioned it last time. The book was released in Arabic, Al-Wafa' bi Asma' al-Nisa, in 43 volumes. And the 8,000 biographies became 9,700 biographies. He managed to add 1,700 new biographies of women transmitters, explained in 43 volumes that he wrote. And all of it is published and available for study now. Okay? So inshallah, with all of this, we can clearly conclude that from the beginning, from the onset of Islam, there has been a living tradition of woman scholarship and a strong relationship between woman and knowledge and reason in Islam. This is not something that happened as a result of some reform movement in recent times. This has always been the case from the earliest times that we can study Islamic history and where we have some documentation of these women's biographies. And of course, we believe that all of this was brought on explicitly by the teachings of this religion. This is not a movement that would have happened by itself on its own in any society. We know this for a fact, and anyone who understands the type of world in which Islam was revealed and brought and in which it emerged, we know that this should not have been the natural evolution of that society. We know that there was a point of inflection and everything changed from one direction to another, and then we have this type of scholarly output emerge and continue throughout the generations and the centuries. Inshallah, with this we conclude our discussion. Part of the reason why I repeated it is we did not have enough time to focus on the findings. We focused on the biographies the last time we met. We went through the findings very quickly, so I wanted to make sure that they are well understood. The biographies were simply samples, first. And secondly, also, unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties last time, and we received a lot of comments that most of the lecture was missed for one reason or another. So inshallah, with this, we also, although presented in a different way, inshallah, is useful in that regard. And the lectures, inshallah, are being recorded, and they will be put up one way or another in a few days with all the audio, inshallah, not missing. Next, as we said, inshallah, there's two more groups that we want to look at very quickly as part of who belongs to the community of knowledge. The family, I think, deserves a quick word. Even though I am not planning on spending too much time on it, inshallah, it will be clear, just a few hints. And then the intellectual. And here, I don't know, it depends on the level of interest. We may spend more time or less time. I think perhaps 1 to 2 lectures should be sufficient if there is not a lot of interest, just so that we understand the topic. If there's a lot more interest, we can spend a few more lectures on it to understand what we mean by the role of the intellectual, the educated intellectuals in the community of knowledge in Islam. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.